Record-breaking heat waves, wildfires, devastating flooding. As millions of people across the globe cope with extreme weather, critical talks get underway in Beijing between the United States and China. Can the world's top economies find common ground on the climate crisis?
Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. China's special envoy for climate change, Xie Zhenhua, met with his American counterpart, John Kerry, in Beijing on Monday in what the two countries hope are substantial talks on climate action. The meetings, scheduled through Wednesday, are expected to focus on accelerating efforts on clean energy and reducing carbon emissions.
China stands ready to follow through on the important common understandings reached between the heads of state at their meeting in Bali, exchange views with the U.S. side on issues related to climate change, and work together to meet the challenges and enhance the well-being of present and future generations.
For more on the high-level climate talks, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Yixing. He is the former research director of Breakthrough Energy. Here in Washington, D.C., Michael K. Dorsey is the director of Sustainability Solutions Service at Arizona State University and chair professor at ASU's College of Global Futures. Also with us, Paul Bledsoe. He's an adjunct professor with the Center for Environmental Policy at American University. And Chunghwa Wu is the CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center. She is joining us from New York, and I'm going to start with you. Give me your sense of what you expect from these climate change talks. China has pledged to hit its carbon emissions peak by 2030, achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. What do you hope to come out of these talks?
The expectation in my mind is not very high, and I think the major breakthrough is that the two largest economies are finally back on track to start to talk to each other again about climate change. But in terms of substance, I do not have very high expectations, particularly for this trip, because there's no common ground for the two countries to really work on substance in terms of joining forces to drive clean energy revolution. At this moment, the two countries are stuck in the geopolitical rivalry, particularly from the U.S. side, and I just don't see major breakthrough. And so probably it takes more efforts, and it takes some new way of thinking and new methodology, new strategy for the two countries to really come down together to work specifically on technology, industrial value chains, as well as the finance and the trade, in order to really work together to accelerate the clean energy transition, which is urgently needed at this moment.
Paul, Chunghwa Wu has kind of dampened expectations. John Kerry going in the other direction. We have a quote from him. He says that you really need urgent action on climate crisis. And he says in the next 3 days, we hope we can begin talking and taking some big steps that will send a signal to the world about the serious purpose of China and the United States to address a common risk, threat, challenge to all of humanity created by humans themselves. What are your expectations?
Well, I think, Mike, that you had it right at the top of the broadcast, that we are in danger of moving toward climate change tipping points, which will be very difficult to reverse if we don't begin to have the major economies rapidly reduce emissions. I believe we need China and the United States to develop a much more serious and full range of policy options, including trade policy, technology policy, natural gas imports to displace China's huge coal. China uses more than half the world's coal. We need a much more serious U.S.-China climate agenda than we're getting right now. I'm sorry, it is not good enough for our world leaders to continue just talking about it. We are on the precipice of a climate catastrophe that may be incredibly difficult to turn around if the world's two largest economies don't act. We have the ability to deploy clean energy technology, to use trade policy to drive down global emissions, to provide natural gas to reduce coal, to use carbon capture, and a whole range of other technologies. It is time to get serious and stop just talking.
Michael, he sounds a lot like Greta Thunberg, you know, blah, blah, blah. She said the talking stage is over too. I'm sure you feel much the same way. But Chunghwa Wu, to her point, I was reading earlier today a climate activist saying, look, we shouldn't expect a lot of actionable results. These two countries have really not had very robust conversations until recently. We've seen Blinken go and Yellen, now John Kerry. And basically, this is just a continuation of the reset, basically a way to map out a way to restart conversations, not just at these high levels, but also at the working level, which in many ways is even more important. As you know, it's the guys who are in the trenches doing the nitty-gritty work before the Kerrys sit down with his counterpart in China and actually kind of hammer out deals. Do you agree with that? And is that the most we can expect?
Look, Mike, the sine qua non of diplomacy is talking. You know, I'm certainly about the street heat that Greta's of the world and perhaps Paul's and others are keeping on those in C-suites, and we've got to keep up that pressure. But the reality is we've also got to tone down the tensions that we've seen over the past several months between the U.S. and China. I think that this effort by Special Envoy Kerry, you know, going to China is part of that. It's part of what Yellen was doing. It's part of what Blinken has been doing. We've got to keep up that conversation. The other reality, though, is that China is surging forward on the putting stuff in the ground, putting renewables in the ground, particularly wind and solar. They're closing in on their carbon neutrality targets on just solar alone. They're looking at possibly as much as 1.2 terawatts of solar installed, and coming in almost 5 years ahead of schedule. So that's real progress. That's something that we need to highlight. That's a space that the U.S. needs to actually get in, a lane that the U.S. needs to get in. We are actually lagging in terms of the rapid deployment, even with all of the money that the Biden administration has put in to support renewable energy. We're lagging behind the curve. So we could take a lesson from China on accelerating the deployment of renewable energy in this country and really give a hat tip and a nod and a thumbs up and a thank you for that aggressive deployment of renewable energy, which we know is absolutely part of the solution set.
And Yixing, to that point, reducing greenhouse gases, really top of the agenda for Xi Jinping and the government. In 2022, China spent more than $500 billion on investments in solar, wind, electric vehicles, and batteries. What kind of impact is that having in China?
Yes, the impact is really significant. So China has massively ramped up the installation of clean energy. Its solar capacity is greater than the rest of the world combined together. And its wind capacity is roughly equal to the total of the other top 7 countries. And China is also leading in batteries, energy storage, and electric vehicles. So China is the most important stakeholder in the supply chain of clean technology, especially like wind, solar, and batteries. And with the continuous investment in the past 2 decades, China helps reduce the cost of key clean technologies quite significantly. For example, in the last 10 years, the cost for solar and energy storage has declined for 90%. And China made a huge contribution to it. And also China exports low cost and high quality clean technologies to United States, Europe, and other countries, and helping the whole world to decarbonize their economy. And I believe that in the next few decades, with the cost continue declines, and China can help even more by exporting its low cost and high quality clean technologies to other developing countries so that we can truly achieve net zero for the whole world.
And Paul, these talks in Beijing, kind of a prelude to what we're going to see coming up in the United Arab Emirates in November. That, of course, the COP28. But November seems like a lifetime away when you look at the conditions out there right now that you're talking about. I mean, we've seen these extreme weather stories. They're coming at us 100 miles an hour from all over the country and the world. We've got a story from our correspondent, Jim Spellman, kind of talking about what we're seeing here in the United States and our neighbor to the north, Canada. Let's watch that, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. So let's take a look.
Another weekend of extreme weather in the U.S. In California's Death Valley, temperatures topped 52 degrees Celsius, around 125 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh, your arms are burning, your face is burning.
Even away from the desert, much of the southern U.S. is baking under a brutal heat dome.
So the big thing that's causing these high temperatures is a very strong area of high pressure. And we're seeing this high pressure get to near record levels in terms of its intensity. and that's causing a lot of these very high temperatures.
Meantime, across the country in the Northeast, heavy storms brought deadly flooding to multiple states, including Pennsylvania.
All of a sudden, the skies opened up, and I think that so many people are used to the crazy weather these days, just kind of, storms coming down.
And a record wildfire season in Canada is sending heavy smoke across some parts of the U.S., creating dangerous air quality levels for millions. State and local officials are struggling to manage one intense weather event after another.
This is possibly our new normal. This is the kind of weather that even what should normally be a beautiful beach-going Sunday in July can turn into a devastating catastrophe.
Researchers say the current cycle of extreme weather is driven, at least in part, by a developing El Nino weather system combined with human-caused climate change. Last week, the U.S. Congress heard testimony from the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
I consider climate change one of our most significant threats in the future and the crisis of the generation that we're living in right now.
But many climate advocates say so far, the U.S. has failed to treat climate change like a true crisis. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
So, Paul, a two-part question. Is the United States failing to really recognize this as a crisis and really putting the information out there like, look, this is front and center, it's coming, it's like an oncoming train, we got to do something about it right now? And the other part of that is, what kind of messaging can come out of Beijing to kind of set the agenda for what we're going to see in the UAE?
Right. So climate change is now a here and now public safety disaster. People are dying every day in countries all around the world directly from climate change impacts. And this is only going to get far worse. What our guests haven't talked about yet is that natural systems like the Arctic sea ice, like Norwegian glaciers, like our ocean temperatures, which are 90 degrees off the Florida coast this month, they are moving toward the Amazon, moving toward tipping points of moving from net climate and warming inhibitors to net warming contributors. If that begins to happen in the natural systems, what we're seeing now will be just the veritable tip in the iceberg. So this is a much more dangerous situation than I believe most people understand. That is why the U.S. action through the Inflation Reduction Act and the largest ever investment in clean energy the U.S. made last year is so important. It's also worth noting that while China has made very large commitments to solar and EV batteries in particular, they still use more than half of the world's coal. China had promised to begin to phase down coal dramatically essentially this year, and they're not meeting that challenge. So for all their clean energy investments, they're still using more than half the world's coal. China needs to end that level of coal use if we're going to get a hold of climate change.
Zhenhua, let me ask you about that because, this is something I discussed with some experts on this, years ago, and they were talking about the chains of climate change and in the sense that, look, we know we got to get rid of coal, but we also see these heat waves, and they're really withering in China right now. People, when there's heat waves like that, go into their homes, turn on the AC as high as they can. That taxes on the power plants. They have to throw in more coal, and the whole cycle continues. How do you break that cycle?
It's a difficult dilemma, as you pointed out already, as Michael was saying there as well. And China, like the United States and part of Europe there as well, we are experiencing extreme weather events. And if you like a typhoon actually in the southern part of China and extreme heat waves in the northern part of China, and definitely people need air conditioning and even more so, and to keep cool. And that means we need more electricity to power the air conditioning, which is needed urgently at this moment to protect people's health. And somehow, as we're talking about it here, even though China's renewable energy has been really gearing up in terms of installations, somehow the pace is not fast enough to replace coal dramatically at this moment. So it is a very difficult part of the transition we are stuck in at this moment. But I do like to bring things in bigger perspective. As the other panel members pointed out, China already leading the global effort in terms of clean energy revolution. And compared to the U.S., China is about 1 decade ahead of the curve, actually. And we need to really fully recognize that that's sort of efforts and a contribution not only to, to China's clean energy transition, but really to globally fighting climate change, particularly against the backdrop of more frequent and more intensive climate catastrophes here. And that should become the starting point, actually, for the U.S. and China to talk about how to work substantially work together, in terms of technology innovation, in terms of rebuild global sustainable supply chains, as well as actually opening up more to the markets and joining finance actually to invest in other developing countries. Really accelerate the clean energy revolution. Otherwise, we're going to suffer even more so.
Michael, in preparation for the show, I was reading an article today where some scientists were warning of truly terrifying conditions and the potential that these heat waves that we're witnessing now could get even worse in August. You have ties to Arizona. I saw a gentleman, a doctor in a burn unit in Arizona who was talking about people who are just out for walks, elderly and young, who fall on the pavement. The temperatures of the pavement so high that they're coming into these burn units with burns. Give us an idea of what we're looking at and just how bad things can get and what we need to be doing now.
So the crisis in weather, in extreme weather, not just in heat, but in catastrophic flooding, in cyclones and vast weather events is tremendous. It's affecting communities all over the world, not just in the United States, certainly in the Southwest, in Arizona, where I'm based, but also in China as well. We've seen record-setting temperatures, in Northwest China, and a large part of this is driven by the continued reliance on fossil fuels, and in the Chinese case particularly, its deployment of coal. The last year and a half have seen the largest deployments of coal-fired power in basically the past decade. So that's actually something that the government needs to get a hold of. And we also have a responsibility, both us, the United States, and the Chinese, of really beginning to ramp up the reduction in our use and deployment of fossil fuels. Neither of us are really leading on this, and we need to put those plans in place in order to accelerate the downsizing of fossil fuels, which are driving the problem of extreme weather around the world and affecting communities from Arizona to Maine, but also from Hong Kong to Beijing and many, many other countries across and around the world.
Yixing, the climate talks in Beijing happening as we're talking about what's happening around the Earth. It's just heating up like crazy. The northwest region of Xinjiang hit its highest temperature ever on Sunday. That was 52 degrees Celsius. Beijing, as you know, experiencing an enormous heat wave right now. It's known for being hot and humid in the capital during the summer months, but give us a sense of what it's like there right now. Just how bad is it?
Yeah, so it is a very hot summer for China this year. So since 1951, so Beijing has seen temperatures reaching 40 degrees on only 11 days, and with almost half of them actually happening in the past few weeks. So including a new record high for the city's hottest day in June. And also in the United States, the extreme heat wave is also reaching a very high point, especially in the southwest of the United States. It reached 49 degrees. So right now, this is a really good time and a reason for U.S. and China to restart the effort to collaborate and fight climate change together. So last year, for almost 2 months, the extreme heat dried up reservoirs, killed crops and livestock, crippled power supplies, and lead to rolling blackouts in many of the Chinese cities. And this year, the high temperature comes even earlier. I think there is a 98% chance that at least one in the next 5 years, the temperature is going to beat the record. And due to the warming effect of El Nino and the human-induced climate change. So I have to say this year is a very hot summer. but one of the next 5 years is going to be even more challenging. So there is really urgent for United States and China to collaborate and fight it.
Paul, you brought up coal earlier, and I was talking to Chunghwa Wu about these chains of climate change. How do you break it? That still is an issue, isn't it? Baseload, you have to be able to power up quickly and bring it down. And when you turn to sources, from what I've heard, it's coal, it's natural gas, it's nuclear, and a lot of people say those aren't the best options. I mean, is there any kind of breakthroughs on the horizon there?
These are good questions. For one thing, using gas, particularly if you make sure it has near zero methane emissions, can reduce carbon dioxide emissions by half over coal. So the U.S. cut its emissions largely by switching away from coal toward gas. So that's going to begin to happen globally. But ultimately, we're going to need some other new technologies to get cheaper. One of them, as one of your guests mentions, is electricity storage at large scale. We still can't do that, and that's crucial. But it's pretty clear that we're going to need advances in carbon management. And by that, I mean both point source carbon capture of emissions from power plants, secured safely underground, and potentially actually carbon dioxide capture from the atmosphere, from the open air. Emissions are so high now that all of these technologies are going to be necessary to deal with the problem. Again, I feel it's far later in the game than people are pretending, including our global leaders, both in China and the U.S. We are on the edge of a global emergency, and the two largest economies and most important nations in the world need to lead. And I hope, of course, they have to talk to one another to make that happen. But it is time for them to give us some very specific, concrete, new initiatives, new money, new technology goals to help save the livable lives in people around the world. This is a public safety and national security issue for everyone around the planet, and we need Beijing and Washington to lead.
And Paul, I know you brought up the Biden administration and the efforts by Joe Biden to try and take on the climate change with some of his initiatives. But the administration recently approved this contentious oil and gas drilling project in Alaska, and the Sierra Club says it's the wrong move. It'll be a disaster for wildlife, lands, communities, and our climate. He's saying one thing and in many respects doing a lot in that direction, but then this happens. And I know a lot of climate activists were very unhappy with this move. Why both? I mean, it seems like it's this dichotomy. You get one and then you get the other as well.
Right. So why is China building the largest build out of coal-fired power plants in the last decade over just the last 18 months? That's the wrong policy. Regarding the Alaskan oil development, apparently the company had the rights and the Biden administration was likely losing court. But nonetheless, the point is the same. We need to invest in these breakthrough technologies like carbon capture, like electricity storage, like geothermal energy that could be used all around the world. These have to be our focus of investments. And the U.S. and China are the two global leaders. U.S. national laboratories have invented most of those technologies. China has helped reduce their overall commercial costs. These two economies in the world are the most important in driving down the costs of clean technology so that we can beat fossil fuels on cost. That's what ultimately has to happen for the largest change.
And Chunghwa Wu, I know that you led off our discussion by saying, you shouldn't have too high hopes for these talks. But if you were to have high hopes for these talks, I mean, what would you like to see these two leaders discussing? And what kind of messaging could they have at the exit of this that could signal to the world, hey, we're taking this seriously, we want the rest of you to kind of follow suit?
Well, a couple of ways of looking at it. If you look at what has been agreed or declared by the two countries actually over the last few years, particularly the Glasgow, bilateral climate statements, we already said very specific things actually in our declarations or statements already, saying joint efforts we need to take and collaborations we need to make in order to demonstrate to the rest of the world that the world's two largest economies are seriously, working together to advance the fighting climate change. But in reality, we are just not moving a nickel at all. So for this particular meeting, John Kerry's visit, as I said early on, I do not have much expectations, but I do have another suggestion. As we're talking about here today on this panel, I think let's stay away from generalizing general statement about should, the crisis, whatever. We do need to start to ask some more difficult questions. For instance, like Paul has been mentioning, U.S. need to sell China natural gas in order to replace coal. Then we could also ask the question, China is already leading in solar energy, wind energy, EV battery, stuff like that. And why the U.S. is shutting the door to, block Chinese exports to U.S. market there, right? And if difficult questions like this not answered, not addressed, not seriously discussed, I really doubted very much that the two countries would really seriously able to work together to advance the agenda, rather than just putting out some general statement, say, oh yeah, climate change is a crisis, and the two countries need to do this and that. But in reality, nothing, barely anything changed at all on the bilateral front.
Michael, can you talk a little bit about that, the sense of containment rather than cooperation?
Well, look, I would strongly agree that there needs to be, much more cooperation, and one space in which that could be done is on the trade front, in terms of, enabling better access to, Chinese panel production, solar panel production, as well as batteries and EVs and the like. We've got to accelerate the things that are part of the solution set. That's renewable energy broadly, whether it's in panels and EVs and storage and so forth. We've definitely got to do more of that. We've also got to really, I think, make real commitments, not just pledges. China made a pledge coming out of Glasgow in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions and methane. I would strongly agree that pledges aren't enough, and we've got to have a pathway of reducing China's build-out of coal-fired power, just as much as we have to put more monies on the table, not just for China and the U.S., but we've got to have the richest countries, the largest economies, put more monies on the table for those that are disproportionately harmed in Africa and Asia and Latin America. We know that countries that have the least responsibility of this global problem of the climate catastrophe that we're seeing with these extreme temperatures and so forth, they suffer the first and the most, and they need key resources. They need loss and damage facilities that are going to be properly capitalized, that can get them the resources that they need. So those are some things that both China and the U.S. could, put together over the next coming days, and also begin to, I think, accelerate the conversation on the road to the conference of the parties at the next climate negotiations coming up at the end of the year in Abu Dhabi.
Good advice there, and some great analysis from all four of you. Can't thank you enough. It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate it. That's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.